You're watching World Insight. Still to come on our program, the ANO party, led by a populist Czech billionaire, won the Czech parliamentary election with 30% of the vote. Will the new prime minister follow others in Eastern Europe in challenging the European project of Brussels? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. The Czech centrist ANO movement, led by populist billionaire candidate Babis, has won the country's parliamentary election on Saturday. The ANO party raked about 30% of the vote for 78 seats in the 200-member parliament, but it may struggle to find coalition partners. Mr. Babis is a 63-year-old Slovak-born chemicals, food and media tycoon, has vowed to steer clear of the eurozone. He also echoes other Eastern EU leaders who accuses Brussels of attempting to limit national sovereignty by imposing rules like migrant quotas. But he favors a united Europe and balks at talk of a Czexit. So could the winning party of the Czech Republic turn to the right for Babis, the Prime Minister in waiting? Let's ask our panelists. We are joined by Jeremy Garlick, who is a lecturer in international relations at Jan Masaryk Centre for International Studies of the University of Economics in Prague. And also in London, we invited Iain Begg, who is a Professorial Research Fellow at the European Institute, London School of Economics and Political Science. I want to welcome both of you gentlemen for being with us. Well, shall we ask Mr. Garlick first, what happened? It seems that the far right is gaining so much in the Czech election. Nobody expected that, apparently.
Well, if I can just clarify initially that the party that has gained almost 30%, ANO, which means yes in Czech, is led by Andrej Babis, is actually positioned as a centre to centre-right party. So they are not, at least on paper, they are not actually a far-right party. There is a second party in the election that gained about 10.5%, led by Tomio Okamura, who is a Czech who is half Czech, half Japanese, but is a Czech citizen. That party is more to the far right. So the question would be whether ANO is going to try to form a coalition with that party. Then we might see a leaning to the right. But as it stands at present, as far as I understand it, the ANO party is more to the centre or centre-right. So it's not such a kind of extreme swing to the right as we may have seen in other recent elections in Central Europe.
However, the possibility of forming a coalition government with a far right and the rise of the far right party, the gaining of more parliamentary seats, is still a surprise to many from other parts of the world. Mr. Garlick.
Well, to clarify again that the far-right party in the previous election had, led by Tomio Okamura, had about 6.5 or 6.8% of the vote. It's now gained about 10.5% of the vote. So that, yes, there's been an increase in that vote, but I think what viewers need to understand is that the Czech political scene is really quite complex and fragmented. Because of the proportional representation system. There are actually 9 parties, which is a record, and 9 parties have gained seats in this election by gaining 5% or more of the vote. So we actually have a very confused picture at the moment. And not all of those parties are from the right of the sphere. It's true that 2 of the leftist parties' vote went quite down, and the previous ruling Social Democrats lost a large part of their seats. But there are some other parties that have come up. To me, actually more surprising is the rise of the Pirates, who are a kind of civil, in campaigning for liberal rights and civil rights. So they've actually come up even more than the Okamura party. They actually have about the same amount of the vote. So the far-right party is actually only in 4th place.
Okay.
But of course, yes, it's a concern that there may be a swing in that direction.
All right, Mr. Begg, I want you to join in because Mr. Garlick is certainly looking at the Czech situation more locally, but what we are talking about seems to be is a trend that we have seen in elections in many capitals so far, different kinds of countries in Europe. The far right, whether you say it's the 4th largest, or it's gaining 30%, or it's gaining 50% of seats in one country or another, or it's likely to come into the coalition government, all of these are ringing the bells once and again. Are we going to see people, that's people's concern. The history repeated that in Europe decades ago, there were, before the war, the trend against the immigrants, the trend against certain kinds of race. And we see that eventually evolved after years going on into something dramatic and certainly horrific. And people are asking the question, are we going to see the history repeated? Is there any concern about that?
Well, I think I agree with Mr. Garlick that it's still a small minority who are voting for the extreme right. It's only 12%, and the ANO party, which has won the overwhelming proportion of the seats, it's gained 78 out of 200, and by far the biggest party, has already said it's not going to go into coalition with the SPD, which is the right-wing, very right-wing party. We see more in Austria last week. I think the Czech position is not dissimilar to Germany, where you saw the AfD in Germany gains of the order of 12%, but all the other parties saying, no, we're not going to form a coalition with them. So we have this confused picture, 9 parties in the Czech Republic, ANO very much in the lead, but having to rely on at least one other party and possibly 2 other parties to form a governing coalition. The paradox is that you could well find exactly the same 3 parties in the next Czech coalition, which is the centre-right, the ANO party and the centre-left, as was in the previous coalition, with the further paradox that the claim that Babis made when he was trying to be elected was he was the party of change, and yet he was the one coming from government. He's a previous finance minister. So it's very, very confusing. I don't think we should draw too alarming a lesson from this about the far right gaining ascendancy in Europe. It just isn't. It's arithmetically a small minority.
But we still see the impact that some of the far right parties has created. Even the winning party that we start talking about, the majority, they are also talking about anti-immigrants and anti-eurozone and yet pro-Europe. So how are we going to read these mixed messages coming from different political parties? And will that eventually influence the overall landscape, political landscape in the eurozone or about the eurozone itself, the European Union itself? Mr. Begg, briefly.
Well, I think that there is an unsolved problem at European level about migrants and refugees. And the difficulty that we have there is that because the European level hasn't succeeded in getting a common policy, you find all these reactions going on in member states. Now, the Czech Republic has very few migrants. It's quite a homogeneous society. It's unlike Austria, where the migrant route was very much through Austria, and that has triggered what we saw last week there. Now, for the eurozone, you should remember as well that the Czech Republic has been one of the few countries which has been very strongly against joining the euro. Its previous president, Václav Klaus, was very hostile to the euro. Indeed, if you hear him in public, he can be very savage about the euro as a construction. I was once on a panel with him where he was saying very negative things about the euro. Czech Euroscepticism, as practiced by this new party, the ANO party, is rather limited because the Czechs recognize they gain from being in Europe. And I think that it's far better to think of the ANO party led by Babis as one which is populist but in a business-orientated way rather than pandering too much to fear of migrants.
Mr. Babis' party, ANO, or ANO, as you said, won nearly 30% of the vote in the election on Friday and Saturday. That's nearly 3 times as much as its closest rival. But many parties expressed reluctance about forming a coalition with it. Well, Mr. Babis, fight off fraud charges or rejected the idea outright. Now let's go to you, Mr. Garlick. Some suggest the Czech politics has been very much a firm base of democracy, and people have been also talking about, you know, Czech has been a country that's been moving smoothly, but still through this election people say they see some signs of concerns. What is this to you when you are doing research about your country's politics?
Well, I think the situation in the Czech Republic is one in which the Czech people are quite a pessimistic kind of people about, you know, they're often dissatisfied with the politicians that they have and the system that they have. So I think what this election represents is an expression of dissatisfaction with the status quo by certain portions of the population. It's quite a volatile situation. It's quite complex. It's not easy to solve. But I think we do see a move away from the mainstream, old mainstream parties towards more rising, you know, so-called populist parties that represent an alternative to the status quo. Particularly, let's say, younger people are looking for an alternative to the older parties. This is why, as I say, the Pirate Party, which represents you know, e-commerce and e-government, has got, I think, a large portion of the vote from young people. So what we see is a move away from traditional politics towards a kind of more populist kind of politics.
Against the refugees, against the Muslims, and also against the so-called rotten establishment. That seems to be the phrases that we have seen over and again in the European elections over the past 2 years. Mr. Begg, we only have very few time left. Can you help us understand, is this going to be the future trend of European politics, and what would that mean eventually for the overall existing policy frameworks that both the EU embraces and also the member countries embrace?
Well, there are probably two quick answers to this in too short a time. The first is that until Europe collectively solves the problem of how to manage the refugee challenge, we'll see a repeat of these kinds of objections. But with this odd paradox that countries like Poland or the Czech Republic, which seems to be resisting migrants, simply don't have them. They're concerned about the fear of it. What you're also seeing is some reassertion of what I might call a Central European identity. The Czech Republic, the Poles, the Hungarians, and to some extent the Austrians are showing similar trends in their economies. But it's rapidly evolving, and I would not make too much of saying there's a new Eastern European or Central European populist bloc. Rather, it's domestic politics which are trying to change things. Some regard the arrival of Babis as being the new Trump. I would disagree with that. I think he's much more like a different politician,
I see.
Not particularly strong repute, which is Silvio Berlusconi.
All right. Well, things are complicated. Again, it's in each country's politics, but overall, does it really suggest something when they're combined together? Thank you so much, both of you, Jeremy Garlick and Iain Begg. Thank you. Really appreciate it. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, find us, World Insight CGTN, in your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.